All right, get ready to have your mind blown because today we're diving into some seriously controversial stuff, the Apollo moon landings. We're going to unpack some fascinating arguments presented by Dave McGowan in his Wagging the Moondoggy series, where he really digs into the evidence and raises some thought-provoking questions about those missions.
What's fascinating about McGowan's work is that he encourages us to think critically about one of history's most iconic events. He doesn't just present a bunch of conspiracy theories, he lays out his arguments methodically, backing them up with historical context, scientific analysis, and a healthy dose of skepticism.
Exactly. And our goal today isn't to convince you of any particular viewpoint. We're simply going to present McGowan's arguments and let you, the listener, decide what you make of them. Think of it as a mental workout, a chance to flex those critical thinking muscles.
So, let's set the stage. It's the 1960s, the Cold War is at its peak, and the US and the Soviet Union are locked in a fierce space race.
The stakes are incredibly high: national pride, technological superiority, and the potential for military dominance are all on the line. And remember, the Soviets had a significant head start. They were racking up the first satellite in orbit, first animal in space, first man in space. It seemed like they were unstoppable.
Right. And this is where McGowan's argument starts to get interesting. He points out that despite the Soviets' early lead, they never attempted a moon landing. Not then. Not even decades later.
That's a really good point. If they were so close to winning the space race, why wouldn't they have gone for the ultimate prize? Planting your flag on the moon.
Exactly. It's a question that's puzzled many people over the years, and McGowan suggests that the answer might be more complicated than we've been led to believe. He presents the argument that perhaps the Soviets knew something that the American public didn't, that maybe landing on the moon in the 1960s with the technology available at the time was simply impossible.
Okay, now that's a bold claim, but let's hear him out. What evidence does he present to support this argument?
Well, one of McGowan's most compelling points centers on the alleged missing evidence from the Apollo missions, and we're not talking about a few misplaced files here. NASA claims to have lost a staggering amount of crucial data, including the original telemetry tapes, biomedical readings, voice recordings, and even the raw footage of the moonwalks.
Hold on. They lost all that. The original footage of the moon landing is just gone? That seems a little hard to believe, doesn't it?
It does raise some eyebrows, for sure. We're talking about 700 boxes of recordings, all supposedly vanished sometime in the late 1970s.
700 boxes. You'd think they'd have at least one backup copy tucked away somewhere, right? It's like saying you wrote the next great American novel and then accidentally threw away the only manuscript.
Right, and this missing evidence creates a real problem when it comes to verifying NASA's claims. Without the raw data, it's impossible to independently confirm their findings or analyze the missions in detail.
So we're basically supposed to take their word for it. Just trust that everything happened exactly as they say it did.
That's essentially what McGowan challenges us to consider. He argues that the lack of primary source material raises serious doubts about the authenticity of the missions, forcing us to rely solely on NASA's narrative, which, as we'll see, has its own set of inconsistencies.
Okay, so the missing footage is definitely suspicious. What other evidence does McGowan point to?
Well, let's talk about those iconic moon rocks, the ones brought back by the Apollo astronauts as proof of their lunar adventures.
Oh yeah, the ultimate souvenirs. What about them?
McGowan acknowledges that authentic moon rocks do exist on Earth. They arrive naturally as lunar meteorites, and Antarctica is a prime location for finding them. But he raises a fascinating point about Wernher von Braun, a key figure in the Apollo program.
I've heard of him. Wasn't he a German rocket scientist who helped develop the Saturn V rocket?
That's the one, and here's where it gets interesting. Von Braun led a team of Apollo scientists to Antarctica in 1967, 2 years before Apollo 11.
Okay, that's a bit of a coincidence. What were they doing there? Collecting penguin souvenirs?
McGowan suggests that they might have been collecting those lunar meteorites, perhaps to later present them as moon rocks brought back by the Apollo missions.
So, he's suggesting they planted fake moon rocks. Isn't that a bit far-fetched?
It might sound like a conspiracy theory, but McGowan points to some intriguing historical precedents. Remember the infamous moon rock given to a Dutch museum? Turned out it was just a piece of petrified wood.
Oh yeah, I remember that story. Pretty embarrassing for the Dutch. But does that one fake moon rock really invalidate all the others?
It's not about invalidating all of them, but it does raise the question of provenance. If one moon rock turned out to be a fake, how can we be sure that others haven't been misrepresentatively even planted? Especially considering, as you mentioned earlier, that a significant number of moon rocks gifted to other countries have mysteriously disappeared over the years.
Okay, that's a valid point. The moon rock situation is definitely a bit more complicated than I initially thought. So what else does McGowan focus on?
Well, let's take a closer look at those lunar modules. The spacecraft that supposedly landed on the moon. Have you ever really studied their design?
I have to admit, I haven't given them much thought. They just look like, well, spaceships to me. What's so special about them?
McGowan describes them in a rather humorous way. He compares them to something cobbled together from spare parts in someone's garage. held together with zippers and gold tape.
Okay, that's a funny image. But I'm guessing he's making a point here, right? It's not just about their aesthetic appeal.
Exactly. He's highlighting the seeming flimsiness of their construction and questioning how such seemingly fragile vehicles could withstand the harsh conditions of space, extreme temperatures, micrometeorite impacts, and the intense radiation we discussed earlier.
That's a good point. I mean, we're talking about a spacecraft that's supposed to travel hundreds of thousands of miles, land on another celestial body, and then return safely to Earth. You'd think it would need to be a bit more robust than a glorified tin can.
That's precisely what McGowan argues, and he goes even further, questioning the logistical challenges of fitting everything needed for a moon mission into such a cramped space: life support systems, fuel, scientific equipment, and of course that iconic lunar rover.
Speaking of the rover, whatever happened to that folding technology that allowed it to fit inside the lunar module like a suitcase? You'd think that would be a game changer for space exploration. But we haven't seen anything like it since the Apollo era.
It's another one of those technological marvels that seem to have vanished without a trace. And this, according to McGowan, raises further doubts about the authenticity of the missions. Why would such groundbreaking technology, supposedly crucial for the moon landings, simply disappear from the annals of space exploration?
It's like they invented time travel, used it once to go back to the 60s and fake the moon landing, and then promptly lost the instructions.
Okay, maybe not time travel. But the point is, McGowan uses these seemingly small details, the missing footage, the questionable moon rocks, the flimsy lunar modules, and the vanishing technology, to build a larger argument about the plausibility of the moon landings.
This is getting really interesting. I'm starting to see how he connects all these different pieces of evidence, but we're just scratching the surface here, right?
We are. There's a lot more to unpack. For instance, have you ever noticed anything strange about the photographs taken on the moon?
Like what? I know they're grainy and black and white, but I always assumed that was just because of the technology at the time.
Well, McGowan points out a much more perplexing detail: the lack of stars in any of the moon landing photos.
Wait, no stars? But wouldn't the astronauts have had the most incredible view of the night sky imaginable, without any atmospheric distortion?
You would think so, right? And yet none of the photos show a single star in the background. Not one.
Okay, now that is weird. What's the explanation for that? Didn't they take any pictures of the stars?
The standard explanation is that the camera exposures were set to capture the bright lunar surface and the astronauts, making the faint stars invisible. But McGowan debunks this by pointing to other NASA photos taken in space where objects in the foreground are clearly visible against the blackness of space. And guess what? No stars there either.
So if the camera settings weren't the issue, then what was it? Were they just too busy planting flags and collecting rocks to notice the most spectacular stargazing opportunity in human history?
That's a question McGowan encourages us to ponder. And it's not the only photographic anomaly he highlights. He also points out the issue of non-parallel shadows in some of the moon landing pictures. While perspective and the lunar landscape can explain some shadow discrepancies, there are a few photos where those explanations just don't hold up.
Like the iconic Man on the Moon photo of Buzz Aldrin, where the lighting suggests there might have been a secondary light source, as if they were on a movie set.
Exactly, these photographic inconsistencies, along with the missing footage, the questionable moon rocks, and a seemingly implausible technology, form the foundation of McGowan's argument.
Wow, I have to admit, he's presenting a pretty compelling case. But this is only part one of our deep dive, right? There's still more to uncover.
Oh, there's much more. In part two, we'll explore some of McGowan's more controversial arguments, including the potential role of the media in perpetuating the moon landing narrative, and the possible motivations for such an elaborate deception. Buckle up, because things are about to get even more thought-provoking. Welcome back to our deep dive into Dave McGowan's Wagging the Moon Doggy.
So far, we've journeyed through missing data, examined moon rocks, and even questioned the lunar module's design.
And now we're venturing into a particularly fascinating area: the inconsistencies in the astronauts' accounts of their lunar experiences.
Okay, this should be interesting. I'm all ears.
You see, when you compare the astronauts' descriptions of walking on the moon with the visual evidence, some intriguing discrepancies emerge.
Such as? Give me an example.
Well, several astronauts described the lunar surface as slippery, almost as if they were walking on ice. But if you watch the footage, they seem to move relatively easily, as you'd expect in a low-gravity environment. Not much ice skating going on there.
That's a good point. It doesn't quite match up, does it? What else doesn't add up?
There are also discrepancies in their descriptions of the lunar dust. Some astronauts described it as incredibly fine and pervasive, clinging to everything. Yet in some photos, the lunar module's landing pads appear remarkably clean, with minimal dust disturbance.
If I remember correctly, lunar dust was supposed to be a major concern for the missions, Right, they even designed special brushes to try and clean it off the equipment.
Exactly. So the visual evidence doesn't always seem to match up with the astronauts' descriptions of the challenges they faced. McGowan uses these inconsistencies to suggest that perhaps their experiences weren't quite as they've been portrayed.
Okay, but couldn't these discrepancies just be chalked up to human error? I mean, remembering details accurately, especially under such extraordinary circumstances, can't be easy.
That's certainly a possibility, but McGowan digs deeper, questioning why none of the astronauts have ever publicly challenged the official narrative, despite these inconsistencies and unanswered questions.
You'd think someone would have come forward by now, right? If there was something fishy going on, surely at least one astronaut would have broken ranks.
It's a question that has fueled a lot of speculation. Some theorize that the astronauts were pressured into silence, maybe out of concern for national security or to protect America's image.
It's like a cosmic code of silence. What happens on the moon stays on the moon.
Well, maybe not quite that dramatic. But the point is, this lack of dissent from those who were supposedly there adds another layer of intrigue to the whole debate.
This is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about the moon landings. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, and each layer reveals something even more intriguing.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of peeling back layers, let's examine another facet of McGowan's argument: the technological plausibility of the missions, particularly the spacesuits.
Ah, yes, those iconic white suits. They looked pretty futuristic for the time, didn't they? What's the issue with them?
Well, they were supposedly marvels of engineering, capable of protecting astronauts from radiation, extreme temperatures, and micrometeoroid impacts, all while allowing for mobility and dexterity.
Yeah, you'd need a pretty high-tech suit to survive on the moon. What's McGowan's take on them?
He highlights a rather intriguing discrepancy. NASA is currently very concerned about radiation and the need for elaborate shielding in their plans for future moon missions. Yet those 1960s spacesuits seemingly offered incredible protection with what appears to be much less advanced technology.
So the suits that went to the moon supposedly had better radiation protection than what NASA's developing now. That doesn't seem quite right.
Exactly. McGowan argues that this technological inconsistency raises questions about the authenticity of the missions. How could those seemingly simple suits provide more protection than the sophisticated technology being developed today?
It's almost as if those Apollo suits were too good to be true.
That's the feeling McGowan evokes. He suggests that perhaps we haven't been told the whole story about those spacesuits and their capabilities.
Okay, but let's play devil's advocate for a second. Couldn't it be that we've simply lost some of the knowledge about how those suits were made? After all, technology doesn't always move in a straight line. Sometimes we lose techniques or knowledge along the way.
That's certainly possible. However, remember that NASA claims to have also lost the blueprints for those suits, along with most other technical documentation from the Apollo program.
Oof, that missing data again. It's like they were playing a cosmic game of hide and seek with the evidence.
It does make it difficult to verify their claims, doesn't it? We're forced to rely on their narrative without being able to independently examine the evidence.
It's frustrating to say the least. It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but with half the pieces missing.
Well, that's precisely what makes this whole topic so fascinating. We're left to piece together the puzzle with the limited information we have, relying on critical thinking and a healthy dose of skepticism.
Okay, so we've got missing data, questionable moon rocks, flimsy lunar modules, magical spacesuits, inconsistent astronaut accounts. I'm starting to see a pattern here.
A pattern of inconsistencies and unanswered questions, you might say. But hold on tight, because we're about to dive into an even more controversial aspect of McGowan's argument: the role of the media in all of this.
Now, this should be interesting. What does the media have to do with the moon landings?
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Dave McGowan's Wagging the Moon Doggy.
We've explored missing evidence, scrutinized the technology, and even questioned the astronauts' accounts. Now I'm really curious to hear what McGowan has to say about the potential motivations behind this alleged moon landing hoax.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Why go through all the trouble of faking such a monumental event? McGowan offers a few compelling arguments.
Okay, let's hear them.
One of his most prominent arguments centers on the Cold War context. Remember, this was a time of intense rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, both vying for global dominance.
Oh yeah, the space race was in full swing. Both superpowers were desperate to prove their technological superiority.
Exactly. McGowan argues that the U.S. government, facing pressure to win the space race, may have resorted to staging the moon landings as a propaganda victory.
So, it was all about one-upping the Soviets, a cosmic game of one-upmanship.
That's one interpretation. A staged moon landing would have been a massive propaganda coup, boosting national morale, unifying the country, and showcasing America's technological prowess to the world.
It would have been a huge win for the U.S. on the global stage, but wouldn't it have been incredibly risky? I mean, If the Soviets had exposed the deception, it would have been a colossal embarrassment.
Absolutely, but McGowan suggests that the U.S. government may have calculated that the potential rewards outweighed the risks. The moon landings provided a powerful symbol of American exceptionalism, a beacon of hope in a time of global tension.
It's like they were saying, look at what we can achieve. We can even conquer the moon.
Exactly. It was a message that resonated deeply with the American public and the world. And beyond the propaganda value, McGowan suggests that the alleged hoax could have also served economic interests.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, consider the massive amount of funding poured into the Apollo program. Billions of dollars were funneled to aerospace companies, research institutions, and military contractors.
So he's saying that the moon landings, even if faked, helped to fuel the growth of the military-industrial complex.
That's one of his arguments. The Apollo program, regardless of its authenticity, provided a justification for increased spending on space exploration and related technologies, much of which had military applications.
It's like a self-perpetuating cycle. The more money you pour into it, the more reasons you need to keep it going.
That's the idea McGowan puts forward. He suggests that the moon landings, even if staged, served the interests of those who profited from the space race.
Wow. This is opening up a whole new perspective on the moon landings. It's not just about the science and exploration. It's about politics, economics, and power.
Exactly. And McGowan challenges us to consider these broader contexts when examining the moon landing narrative. He encourages us to think critically about who benefits from the story we've been told.
It's like he's pulling back the curtain on a grand stage production, revealing the machinations behind the scenes.
That's a fantastic way to put it. He encourages us to question the narratives we've accepted as truth and to consider alternative perspectives, even if they challenge our deeply held beliefs.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I've learned so much. And I have to admit, McGowan's arguments have really made me question everything I thought I knew about the moon landings.
That's the power of critical thinking, isn't it? It allows us to challenge assumptions and explore new possibilities.
So where do we go from here? What should we make of all this?
Well, as we've discussed throughout this deep dive, there are a lot of unanswered questions and inconsistencies surrounding the moon landings. While McGowan presents a compelling case for a potential hoax, ultimately it's up to each individual to decide what they believe.
It's like we've been presented with two sides of a coin, and we have to decide which sides we find more convincing.
Exactly. And perhaps the most important takeaway from this deep dive is the importance of critical thinking and healthy skepticism. We should never blindly accept what we're told, especially when it comes to events of historical significance.
It's about questioning the narratives we've been given and seeking out diverse perspectives, even if they challenge our preconceived notions.
Precisely. And who knows, maybe with continued research and open minds, we'll eventually unravel the truth about what really happened during those Apollo missions. Until then, moon landings remain a captivating enigma, a testament to the enduring power of mystery and the human desire to explore the unknown.
Thanks for taking us on this incredible journey. It's been an eye-opening experience. And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic. Read McGowan's work, do your own research, and come to your own conclusions. The truth, as they say, is out there.
Happy exploring.